Hello, Gospel Grace.
Hey, Gospel Grace.
Hey, Gospel Grace.
Hey, Gospel Grace.
Hey, Gospel Grace.
Happy 10th anniversary, Gospel Grace.
Happy birthday, GGC.
Hello, Gospel Grace family.
Just think back to a game of manhunt with John Kopp in Tennessee, to 2 services and church in the park.
We had a wonderful time in our 2 years there, and we think about you all the time.
We look back at our time at GGC with so many wonderful memories.
10 years. 10 years of God's faithfulness, 10 years of God's great grace.
When I think about the name of our church and 10 years, it's almost like this lens, like, oh, the gospel has gone forth. You know, the gospel has been planted. We've been able to have this front row seat, and so many others are with us in this to watch what only God can do. It has only been by God's grace.
Yes, that's right.
You know, when Paul goes, who's sufficient for these things? He'd be the first to raise his hand and say, I'm not.
Yes.
And I raise my hand with him. You know, we all do. Like, we're not sufficient. God's grace has been at work. He has been kind and faithful.
On this side of it, thinking back, there's been a lot of gospel labor over the last 10 years. And yeah, as we celebrate this weekend, the thing that just keeps coming to mind is that it's the Lord who built Gospel Grace. And what a joy it is to look back and see God's faithfulness through it all.
God has used Gospel Grace Church to change my view of the gospel.
Living life alongside Gospel Grace members for the last 10 years has helped me apply the truths of the gospel to my everyday life.
I saw how the gospel that saved me was the same gospel of grace that helped me see that Jesus is always better, and gave others in my church community the freedom to graciously counsel me and graciously push me toward Jesus.
When I think of Gospel Grace Church and how God has used it in my own life over the last years, I think first of all about the preaching of the Word and how His Word has been used to wash over me on Sundays. I'm so thirsty for it.
We learned a lot about living out grace in our daily lives.
The gospel of grace is our motive and our operating system for every day. And God has used this church to teach me that.
We also just really benefited from seeing the gospel preached week in, week out through all the pastors at Gospel Grace, and just a passion for sharing the love of Jesus in a city that really desperately needs to hear about His name.
In 2011, I started preaching on missions for a month at my church down in Texas, and I had all these great goals for the congregation. But at the end of that month, it was really God did a deep work in my own heart.
I think for me, I was burdened for my kids because we traveled on the road, then we go to Northland Camp, and I just was like, my kids got to understand church, and I think the Lord used that first thought for my children to actually highlight Christy and I's need.
As I drove to the church that I pastored, I remember passing church after church, and while that's a significant blessing on one side, the Lord used that in my life on the other to just be this little tap. There are places in the country where the gospel doesn't shine as brightly.
I remember the phone call. I'm on the phone with John Kopp, telling him, I said, I think we're going to go plant a church. And I just remember, John, do you remember that call?
Yeah, I remember saying, well, if there's space for one more on the team, I want to be in.
I think Utah gripped me when we started hearing about the number of evangelical Christians, like of any kind. You could fit all the evangelicals in the whole state of Utah in one church building in Texas.
I think the demographics put Salt Lake City as one of the least evangelized cities. And I think all that kind of answered the where question, like why not Salt Lake?
The more we talked about ministry, the more we talked about how we wanted to live our lives, what was important to us, there was this resonance of mission in our hearts. And that resonance led us to a survey trip out here.
Jonathan, tell us what this is.
This is the Student Center for our student organizations, and just an incredible inroad to the gospel with international students, student organizations.
I think the Lord did some significant things on that trip. I mean, it was special. I can think of conversations that we had in the city where the Lord showed up while we were praying together.
I don't know if you guys remember this, but we were doing a loop around from Salt Lake up to Park City and then around to Ogden by some of the reservoirs. And I'm pumping the gas out by myself. You guys are still in the car. And I'm like, oh, junk. We're going to do this. I just remember it was like I was counting the costs out there. The first month, it was just like flying by the seat of our pants. Because you're trying to move people in.
Every week, yeah.
Because everyone's house was a wreck. Yeah. And so everyone was like doing just drywall and all sorts of little tasks. You know, that week of us all coming in was amazing though, in the sense of, I mean, it was like we're just like flying in. One of you got there Wednesday, another Thursday, another Friday. I know we rolled in on Saturday, and then we had services on Sunday.
Oh yeah.
I mean, it was like,
it was right away.
Right.
Yeah. I can remember, Lucas, you know, you preached that first Sunday, and you were prepping to preach that week you'd moved in, and then we all just kind of piled in to help each other move in. Your piano.
I lost a few friends early on by moving the piano. Your mattress got stolen out of the back of your truck.
Yeah, we learned a lesson that day. You move in quickly. You don't leave anything in the moving truck.
You're not in Oak Ridge, Tennessee.
No, definitely not.
I came here for grad school at the U. I was part of Gospel Grace, attended the second service. And I remember those first few, sermons and those weeks of, I think, helping kind of the core at that point really come alongside what the philosophy of the four. I think God used that in unity. I think there was a special unity in those initial believers because it was difficult. It was hard, there was a lot of hard work, and I think they did it because the mission was what united them.
I was so moved on so many occasions in those services where believers were slugging it out in the city, and it was hard, and they had sacrificed, and people had sold. And we all came together on a Sunday, and I remember Jonathan up there just leading music, and believers just singing their hearts out. And not only was the building like a beautiful place to start, but the music in there warmed my heart.
Those first years, there was the initial team that moved out, but then those first years there were several other families that moved out as well. I just remember stories of faith, people that quit jobs and then looked for jobs when they moved here. And people settling into the city and serving alongside of us and sharing the gospel alongside of us, and then sharing together in God's work and the fruit of the ministry.
Those initial, when we didn't have community groups yet, we actually met in the park.
Kids were in our yard. There was a church that donated a bounce house for children's ministry. So we would have this bounce house in my yard, a kind of a nursery, little middle school ministry, and across the street, there we would gather. I love that we've been, from the fall of 2012 through the summer of 2022, we have been in the park every summer. Just proclaiming the gospel, singing, and shining light.
And a couple of baptisms.
Yeah.
Do you guys remember the first baptism?
I think, if I'm remembering right, was at the North Rec Center up off 6 North.
Yeah.
And we rented it, and it had a hippopotamus little slide for kids in the background.
Yeah, we got in there before they opened the rec center. So, we were in there early that day.
Of his death, raised in the likeness of his resurrection. Let's give her a round.
As I think about the name of our church, Gospel Grace Church, all three of those words are very impactful in my life, as they should be. But the one that is the most impactful recently is the word grace.
When God moved us to Salt Lake City from the Dallas area 10 years ago, we had no idea what He had in store for us.
I'll always remember God's grace hitting home in my life, specifically through singing with my brothers and sisters in Christ at Gospel Grace.
And we were certainly, our lives were just blessed and enriched by the preaching of the Word.
God taught us that serving and ministry
is not something that we're owed or even just a task that needs to be fulfilled, but it is a privilege and a gift, and it's a joy.
When I first arrived at Gospel Grace 9 years ago, I was a new believer, very zealous for the Lord, but lacking in knowledge. The way this church body pursues intentional discipleship has been so instrumental in my life to help to see Christ more fully formed in me.
I just want to say that Lucas, John, and Will are great and all, but we all know that if it weren't for Liesl, Beth, and Christy, there wouldn't be a Gospel Grace, and of course the Lord too.
But I'm so thankful for how the pastors and their wives really poured into me and my husband.
I do want to say how thankful I am for these three women and their friendship. They've shown love and been an encouragement to me personally, and I know they have been that for the family at Gospel Grace.
It was such a blessing to see the Lord provide. You know, I think the steps of faith, they were big. You know, we didn't know what it was going to be like out here. We didn't know how the Lord was going to provide, but He did. And for me, that was people asking me to make websites for them or to design logos, or there were a few churches that kind of hired me as their freelance graphic designer.
I had a little bit of a hard time finding a job. I remember going home and telling Liesl, like, I think I nailed that interview and never got a call back. And then I got a phone call out of the blue, although it wasn't out of the blue, it was of the Lord, that I got a call from the Air Force Base. They wanted someone to work Monday through Friday without chapel responsibilities on the weekend. So it was like God had just put this job on a plate and brought it to me.
So Christy and I we grew up out in Virginia, and in similar echoes of some of the stories, God had been burdening our hearts for church planting in needy areas. And we would drive by a number of churches in the Midwest where God had us working at a small church, and God connected with a need out here in Davis County. And our burden was to be involved with church planting. So God brought us out here in 2013, and we actually got to see the mission on display. We were seeing God make us gospel-centered, grace-saturated disciples of Jesus Christ.
You know, I think about the different people that were moving out here for the church plant. You know, there's a bivocationality to their lives because they were the ones, you know, hauling the trailer up to set up, and they're doing that after hours, you know, and they're the ones that are doing hospitality work, and they're the ones helping us.
Well, taking major leadership in ministries. I mean, there were so many ministries that were led by people that they weren't on staff, they just were burdened to be a part of it.
And they didn't get their dream job usually. So they left a dream job to get just something to put food on the table.
Well, they did what they did because they were like part of this mission, and we wanted to see God do this deep work in Salt Lake City.
Yeah, I think when I think about that, I think about how everyone was all in. You know, you think about our wives, you know, and we're doing late night meetings, we're working 2 jobs, and for them to be, you know, carrying a lot more responsibility at home.
I think the church was family to me. I think of people just picking me up and giving me a ride every Sunday morning to church and back, and being served. And I'm here today as a pastor because, you guys poured into me, but I was discipled by the church, and I was blessed by people. So when Gospel Grace was chartering and started taking on members, I knew that this was something I was going to commit myself to.
The chartering is when they formally committed together in covenant with each other to serve as Gospel Grace Church, and that's when we were affirmed as elders. We want to be in our neighborhoods, and we want our neighbors to know that we love them and we love Jesus, and they can come here. This is a safe place.
But I think that even like that plant camp, and then things like our church in the park that evolved into a real gospel preaching service, and then backyard Bible clubs were very big.
And just seeing communities reached.
We started doing a lot of our outreaches based right here in the church. It was called the Church of Liberty Park. And I remember walking in like in May, and I walked in, and right away, I broke the 10th commandment. I was just going, this is where we need to be. unbelievable. This is where we need to be. It was just so obvious. You're like, oh, this is where it should be. But you can't do that. And then, did Dave reach out to you first? Or who was that?
Their congregation needed a smaller facility at that moment. And it started out as, would you be interested in a lease? It moved into, what would it look like for us to lease from you if you bought the building? Along the way, that whole relationship was just of the Lord. I think of the leadership of the church at Liberty Park and the faith that they had to be able to say, we want this to stay a church. That was such a significant part of this whole story, was they wanted this building on this corner to stay a church.
So the Lord then, it was beyond our capacity. Our little congregation could only come up with, just a little bit. Yeah. But God brought some very sacrificial people.
There were ripple effects of people. I think they were just burdened for Salt Lake. Yes. And that there would be a lighthouse. And
strategic.
And like a more permanent center for the gospel to go out. I think my view of church changed moving here. It was not just something you attend, and it wasn't merely a place you served. It was the gathering of God's people and a family of faith. Yes. And I was so needy, coming in. And I know other people were.
And then all of a sudden, when you're going to die, if you don't meet with God's people, it turns into something that's just so much more meaningful.
To see how the Lord has led in growing a congregation here in Salt Lake specifically has been a big deal to me. But what I quickly became burdened for is that we become a church for the city, that we are not just generically in Utah, but that we are actually here for Salt Lake.
When I first came to Gospel Grace Church 6 years ago, I thought church meant something you do on Sunday or a building.
I think one of the main ways that my time at Gospel Grace impacted my view of the church was in showing me that the church is my true family.
The church is our family.
It's a family who cares and loves each other deeply through seasons of suffering and through seasons of rejoicing.
My view of church has changed from being more of an event and more of a thing that we do to actually the church is people.
Ever since becoming a member of Gospel Grace, my view of the church has changed, especially the local church. I think it's been the difference between viewing church from the outside and then actually stepping in and sitting down at the table around the Word together week after week.
Just so thankful for the investment that the pastors made in me particularly, my understanding of church and ministry.
But what I saw is so many people taking that challenge on and learning the culture here, becoming a part of what goes on here culturally in Salt Lake City in order to make a difference.
From the early days at GGC, our hearts were just knit together with the families of the church, our pastors' families, those who had come to serve. And even though we were far from our real family, through the gospel, we had family that stuck closer than a brother.
I'm thankful that Gospel Grace has shown me the bigger picture of the church and what it looks like to link arms to do work for the gospel with other churches in the valley.
The church was focused on reaching the people of Salt Lake City while making significant personal sacrifices.
Our slogan, Gospel Grace, is for Salt Lake City. Yes, in a sense, it's the city itself, but it's really the people of the city that the church is here for, and we're really here for community, to show people that community and to show people the light of Christ.
Now I can pour that grace out back onto my family, my friends, my church community, my new church community. So I'm so thankful for the grace of Christ in my life.
I think when God began to work in our heart to plant a church here in Salt Lake City, I think the nature of each of us as leaders, I don't think we just wanted to see a church planted. I think our prayer was that we'd be a part of a church planting movement. And that's probably what fuels me even now. Like, I want to be a part of, I don't know, I was just praying. I was like maybe 10 churches that God would help us just be a part of out here. And I think that That's what was driving it. The great need, but to see healthy churches that would outlast my life. It had already been going with the Brooks. Danny and Kristen Brooks, they were serving in South Carolina, and the Lord just began to work in their heart, and they just couldn't shake Utah. And there was a pastor who I'd actually met when I was 5 years old, Lloyd Larkin, and he had just faithfully just built up a church building. He just began to sense there was time to move into a different type of a role. By God's grace, that church voted in a team of folks: Danny Brooks, Kevin Nfuku, Matt Parker, and Daniel Kaminsky. And they came, and it was kind of a whole new rebirth in that they changed the name from Trinity Baptist to Gospel Hope. I just think of all the monies that God's people gave. It's really hard to, somehow think we did it.
Yeah, God burdened his people in such a way for such a time, that you look back and you're just like, this could not have been done without the hand of the Lord and the love of his people.
Yeah, and like this building, walls and brick and all of that, it really, that's not the main thing, but there was an establishing, there was like a stabilizing that happened when it was like, we're kind of home here, and for that to be this next phase of ministry where we're moving towards being able to send out people and moving towards raising up leaders that will join us as pastors.
It's one of the reasons why part of our culture code is purposeful multiplication. Healthy organisms multiply, and healthy churches, we just want to help them do the same, and we want to be part of that.
How did the initial formation of what's now the residency program, how did that start?
We were learning as we were going, and then they wanted to learn along with us and learn from us, and they were co-laborers. So they were taking significant ministry roles in the church and significant care and even shepherding work among the congregation. We would pray and talk about elders who go, in church planting, and elders who stay at Gospel Grace.
Well, I think it's significant that both of these guys went through the residency program.
Well, I was very glad Josh and I got to do the ordination council together. We got to split the difficult.
That was the first one.
That was the first one.
That was a pretty exciting thing too. The dream of actually seeing a church planted, and then the leadership development stage, and then it was exciting for both of us. Exciting, nerve-wracking, but then here we go, that God is doing what we've been praying. You talk about the internship or elder candidacy, what those mean. We had a lot of coffee conversations. I was thinking about the blessings of going through the ups and downs of life, and you do it in community. You do it with wise, godly counselors. It's just a blessing to do that. And the burden of seeing churches planted, maybe I should be a part of that, going out. But actually seeing that being here a part of Gospel Grace is actually a part of sending, whether as a pastoral team or as a church, we're actually a part of church planting going forward. And so that was a significant piece.
I think just thinking of me transitioning to be a pastor, put on my heart to be an elder, and I was being ordained, I knew that I was going to step into it, and the congregation was going to hold me up through it, and they were going to be kind. And I look back at the last 3 years, and I can identify times where I was blessed by the kindness of members, encouraging me, keeping me on it. So I feel like the son pastor of Gospel Grace in some ways.
That's a beautiful picture, because truly we all are. So our coming here in 2019 just allowed us to help the team, begin to focus on how can we get another church plant, and God had it all in the works. So Paul Campbell came through to consider coming to a plant camp, actually. So he did a survey trip. When he came here, the Lord just began to work in his heart. And it kind of coincided with the development of in the interns as well. The Jarretts, the Mitchells, and Moons, all they began to work together.
There's this saying in church planting, you send your best, right? And it's a wonderful thing to say, but on the other side of it, it's hard. It is hard. We sent off some of our best community group leaders, some of our best musicians, some of our best deacons, some of our best disciple makers, caregivers throughout the congregation. So you just look at your congregation, you just kind of take out this slice of
the fillet.
Yeah, strong people, and you send them. But to see fruit, to see investment, to see the Lord provide on this side of it, we're now calendar year removed, the Lord has continued to provide.
When you obey in faith, it's also the mother of invention. And so what I can think of a couple initiatives to respond to such a great swath of leaders moving up.
Lead School was just born out of our desire to raise up leaders to fill in those spots.
The start of the seminary, same thing, right? I mean, we're just trying to plant down in ways that have multiplication and reap harvests beyond us. So training church leaders and servants and sending people out. It was sending our first missionary from here. But God did, I mean, really amazing things. I mean, to be able to send one of our own out to a foreign field during that time, to have 9 to 17 students in different classes for the seminary, to see Lead School kick off with like 65 people sitting there wanting to be trained for next layer service to the church. I think those are works of God.
I think even sending out of Daniel and Christy.
I've been so encouraged at how the Lord has just built culture through some of these big works of God, so sending Bree, and then out of that, there's this momentum to send Daniel and Christy, and to see how the Lord is working that culture all through our congregation has been sweet, and I hope it continues, for the next 10, 20 years in the future.
Disciples who are following Jesus, some of which are going to be senders, and others are going to be goers, and we're seeing that happen in our congregation.
We exist to make gospel-centered, grace-saturated disciples of Jesus Christ for the glory of God.
Gospel Grace, thanks for showing and teaching us what it means to be a church that equips saints for the work of the ministry.
We love you, Gospel Grace.
We love you, Gospel Grace.
I'm very thankful for Gospel Grace Church.
We love Salt Lake City. We love Gospel Grace Church. We love all of you.
Thanks, Gospel Grace.
Congratulations on 10 years.
Love you all and we miss you. I love you all.
Forever thankful.